Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Unlocking the EU Market Cost-Effective Strategies for Regulatory and Clinical Success webinar tonight. Happy to have you together, and a couple of housekeeping rules for you as we are doing this webinar. Obviously, if you have questions, you can ask them in the chat. Don't hesitate to do so. We will go through the webinar and take time to answer them in the Q&A session in the very end. Having said that, let's get started. Today we have three speakers. We have, first of all, Valentina Staroda. She's the CEO of Staroda, regulatory consultancy, and she will take over that aspect of our webinar today. We also have Polina Shatova. She is the Director of Budget and Proposals at Paleos, and she will give insight into this aspect given her background. And finally, it's me, Philip Rath. I'm the Managing Director of Paleos, and will also share my insight into the cost-effective strategies. So with regards to the agenda, a couple of topics we want to cover. We want to give you a quick insight into the key considerations which we think are important for our US listeners. Based on these key considerations, we will give you an insight on the need for integrated cost efficiency, why it's important, what we think about that aspect, how you can approach it. We will give you insight about the specific aspect, clinical trials, and the strategic cost management aspects that we think are important to manage a clinical trial. And finally, to dive into the integrated strategy to give you a perspective on how you can maximize your cost efficiency based on your goals for your drug development program. To finish off, we'll share a couple of do's and don'ts and have a Q&A to give final questions for your answers. So I'll hand over to Valentina to start up with the key considerations.
Yes, thank you, Philip. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about the potential of Europe to register drugs with the EMA or with national authorities. So first of all, let's look at Europe. So Europe is 30 countries. So that means that if you want to bring a drug to the market in Europe, you will be getting a market of 30 countries. And if you look at the market size of Europe, then it's the second largest market after the US, of course. At the same time, Europe can be a global market gateway, market entry, because EU approval or approval by the EMA facilitates also access to the medicines across other countries, because many countries also accept European countries as reference countries, especially in Asia market and also Middle East market. So therefore, that could be interesting market to consider as the second largest market in the world. At the same time, there is a Caucasian population in Europe. That means that population which is acceptable for clinical trials from the FDA perspective, and FDA does accept foreign trials performed not in the US, but in other countries, in European countries, for example. So we'll talk about this potential later on in the webinar. Then we will be discussing the costs and pros and cons of different trials done at different European countries. When you consider entering the market, and at the same way as also bringing a drug to the US market, it is important to remember that regulatory strategy plays a key role for successful market entrance. And if a drug is being brought to the European market, that means that you would be able to follow either centralized procedure or a decentralized procedure, depending on the type of the drug, the indication, and also how new your API, for example, is. And that means that when you formulate your regulatory strategy and start executing the strategy, you will also have chances to validate the strategy across the execution pathway. That means that the fact that you are gathering clinical data will be validated, can be validated continuously. When considering Europe, you shouldn't forget that although there is a mutual recognition agreement between the US and the EU, European qualified person is still required when drug is brought to the market in the EU. So basically, the retesting of a drug is not required. So the European agencies will accept the test results from I would say the foreign US lab, for example, but you'll have to ensure that you have a qualified person in place in the EU. And the same holds also for the QPPV, European QPPV responsible for pharmacovigilance activities. It is also important to remember that EU GMP rules applicable also, or GMP rules applicable in the US, and majority of the rules would be applicable also in the EU, although there are some tiny differences you need to take care of and make acquaintance with those differences, especially for special products like sterile products and some other types of products you can consider. Starting from this year, from January 2025, there is a new regulation on health technology assessments, meaning that European Union takes an important step to facilitate marketing and availability of new medicines to patients. So that means that also the reimbursement is being considered, and there are really changes coming to Europe with respect to the reimbursement procedures, because up to now, until now, every country has and had own procedures for reimbursement, and that's why the medicines could be available to patients at different time frames after the approval and getting market authorization approval. So that new technology assessment regulation will bring hopefully big difference to patients and to allow the quick access to new medicines. Of course, Europe EMEA doesn't exist on its own, so EMEA and FDA have good connections and good strategies to improve the collaboration between the agencies, keep agencies each other informed, and in such a way there is also even a parallel scientific advice possible, and then you also can file a common application forms for orphan drug designations. And also, of course, the ICH is the grounder of the alignment between the regions, the EU and US, but also Japan, and also brings clarity and compliance to companies developing drugs, because they would need to develop their products in accordance to the common standards. So that's why it's very interesting to bring a product on the market in an ICH region. And of course, if an approval is given by one of the agencies, either FDA or an EMA, it will always strengthen approval and increase chances of approval of the drug in a subsequent region. However, there are also precedents that some drugs were approved by the FDA but were rejected by the EMA and vice versa. But in general, the communication and alignment between the requirements of FDA and the EMA play a key role, a crucial role, when companies want to bring drugs on the market in both countries, because basically the requirements in both regions will be taken into account, and the companies can consider requirements and also observations from one of the regions when applying for an approval in another region. So if you look at possibilities and regulatory support programs, I think we are moving to the next slide, that European Union offers different options when companies develop their products, and basically try to gather the clinical evidence, because the clinical evidence is a key for an approval and success of the drug, because finally you'll need to show that the drug is safe and has sufficient efficacy in patients for that indication. At the same time, there are programs which are available in the European Union to get assistance from the regulatory agencies, like innovative task force meetings, which are provided by the EMA to companies developing innovative medicines and help them with shaping their regulatory strategy and shaping later on the clinical pathway and gathering of clinical evidence. That ITF meetings, the Innovative Task Force meeting, could be seen as a parallel or equivalent to Interact meeting provided and facilitated by the FDA. EMA provides possibility to undergo different scientific advice and scientific advices at different stages of development. In the EU, every scientific advice is subject to a fee. So a fee of the EMA for scientific advice can range from 50,000 to 100,000 euros. But however, there are different reductions which could be applicable to drug developers, and especially if drug is developed by a company, a small company, which is classified as a small and medium enterprise, a company consisting of less than 250 people and having income less than 50 million of euros. There are significant reductions provided to those small and medium enterprises. Also for orphan designation applications and drugs designated with that status, there are significant fee reductions. So if you look at the right side of the screen, you see the FDA equivalent on the right side. And for scientific advice meetings with the FDA, you could also see the equivalent in the US as pre-IND meetings and different type B meetings, which can be held with the FDA. Also, there are programs which allow approval of drugs based on limited clinical evidence. And that could be especially interesting when companies are developing drugs for medical needs diseases. So, or where some diseases and some cases, the gathering of data is impossible or unethical. So in those situations, there are also possibilities to get approvals based on limited data. And gather data later, or even, and because it's not possible, just to continue start marketing the drug and continue monitoring the performance and data in the market. So if you look at parallel FDA equivalent, then of course there are also possibilities to undergo the breakthrough designation and undergo the fast track designation with the FDA, compared to the accelerated approvals in the EU and conditional marketing authorizations. Conditional marketing authorization means that of course, the approval can be given based on limited clinical data, but the data gathering should continue after the marketing, bringing the product to the market. In the same way, FDA provides also possibilities to undergo accelerated approval pathways. Also, it's important to mention that SME, small and medium enterprise, it's a term known to the EU and to the US. However, the impact of that status is much more pronounced in the EU, because there are much more reductions, fee reductions, assistance, and scientific support across the entire development. And companies benefit from that very much, especially when they develop orphan drug designations, because in that case, the fees would be reduced to zeros. And you'll see that later on further slides. In the US, the SME term exists as well. However, it has a bit different value and load, because FDA provides assistance and also companies get reductions on fees, but that's limited, and we will talk about that also on the later slides as well. So I think we can move to the next slide. So if you look at the drug development roadmap, and we know that usually you would start with patenting your application, executing all non-clinical studies, starting with toxicity, doing pharmacology, also undergoing clinical development, starting with first in human clinical trials and moving into pivotal clinical trials. And that all will give you a set of data, show that the product is safe and has sufficient efficacy in patient population and can be brought to the market. And that means that the product can be commercialized. At all those stages of development, there are possibilities to undergo a scientific advice with the agency. And the European agency, also stimulates companies to come to them to discuss the development strategy, because in that way, the strategy can be validated and there will be less mistakes made, and there will be less possibility during the entire development to repeat pieces, or maybe smaller pieces, but maybe larger pieces of clinical trials. And that's why it's very recommended to all companies to ensure that the strategy is set rather early in the development. And then, of course, it can be changed, it can be adapted. And that strategy should be validated and discussed with the EMA. And there are plenty of moments. So usual moments to discuss the development topics and issues during development could be very early in the development, starting with ITF meetings, innovative task force meetings, and those meetings could then be changed to scientific advice meetings related to orphan drug designations, even prior to starting gathering the clinical data. So at very early stages, at the stage of proof of concept, or even earlier for small and medium enterprises, at the stage of proof of principle, these meetings can be requested and conducted, and that means that the applicants, companies developing those new treatments could benefit from the advice and view of the agency on the development, and basically they'll get advice on how to tackle some issues during even early development stages. Of course, when first in human trial is planned, scientific advice prior to the start first in human trial is very much recommended, because then it's basically the validation moment of the non-clinical strategy, and that everything is tackled and is safe to go into the patient. And at the end, of course, there are different moments to discuss the clinical development program and undergo scientific advices with EMA. But the logical moment would be also at the end of phase 3, at the end of the pivotal clinical trial, to undergo the scientific advice with the agency to validate that the clinical evidence, as it has to be present in the market authorization file, is present, and the applicant has obtained and gathered all the data which were required for the market authorization application. So that will give you a success to undergo a successful commercialization. And of course, the pre-submission meeting would be the last meeting prior to the submission of MAA or market authorization application to the agency. And as I said, there are different moments to discuss the development, and that is important because the clinical evidence is the key, I would say, key data in the regulatory file. Because as we know, when the development of a drug is started, then it takes usually 10-15 years to develop a drug. Of course, we know examples when the development was done shorter, especially in case of COVID vaccines. It was a special time and special, I would say, effort and special collaboration and engagement of different parties together. But usually, if you look at the timeline of a development process, it would take 10 to 15 years. And of course, it can even go beyond those 15 years. It can move to 20 and 25. And we know that there is a lot of research needed, and out of 10,000 compounds, one medicine probably could be registered. So there is a lot of effort, a lot of research, a lot of steps to be completed. And if you look at the cost would be like in millions and billions of dollars based on for one substance. And then on the right hand side of the slide, you see that clinical trials, they take 50% of the entire development cost. So that means that the clinical trial design and clinical strategy should be right from the beginning, because if you lose your moment and you have to repeat the clinical trial, then you see that it's 50% of the entire development cost. So that's why it's very important to start with the clinical development plan and validate the steps and any adjustments in the plan with regulatory agencies. So now I would just like to give the word to Philip, or to Polina, back to Polina, to address the clinical trial cost.
Thank you, Valentina. Indeed, I will give you a short overview of what's going on in the clinical trial landscape. In recent years, we've seen a wave of mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations that have turned the big CROs, contract research organizations, into true giants. And this trend has reshaped the industry significantly. Looking ahead, the global CRO market is projected to grow by around 50% over the next decade. And the strong momentum toward outsourcing clinical trials by sponsors shows no sign of slowing down. The graph on the next slide illustrates a steep growth trajectory across the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sectors. And as a result, the clinical trial market has been growing as well. According to data from clinicaltrials.gov, the number of registered clinical trials has doubled over the last 15 years, and so have the associated costs. When we talk about the geography of clinical trials, there is no question that the US is the most attractive region from a product marketing perspective. That's why there is such a strong push to run studies there. However, it's important to recognize that clinical trials in the US are by far the most expensive. Whenever possible, it is advisable to allocate a larger portion of the study to more cost-effective regions. Europe is a strong choice. It offers high-quality clinical data that is acceptable by all major regulatory authorities, and it does so at a much more reasonable cost. And if you narrow your focus to Eastern Europe, you could benefit even more. Not only can you reduce costs significantly, but you can also accelerate the patient recruitment. Now back to my colleagues.
Yeah, so if you look at, as we said, like clinical data is crucial, and that the execution of the clinical trial takes approximately 50% of the development budget, then we understand that it's like a big effort to gather the data and big investment to do the clinical trials. So as I said earlier at the beginning of this presentation, that EMEA accepts or proposes and has passed phase to get approval with limited clinical data. And it's going to be very interesting, especially when, as we said, developing a drug for unmet medical needs. So thus, European Union has a PRIME designation in the same way as US has the breakthrough therapy designation. It is not an approval, it's a designation. It's a help in during the development, and it's mainly it's meant for serious conditions and when early data show potential benefit. So basically that there will be substantial improvement over the existing therapy. And that the key benefit of that PRIME designation, or as I said, compared to the breakthrough therapy designation, that the agency will give an accelerated assessment and also will provide the developers with regular and early advices during their entire development. At the same time, when the medicine is granted a PRIME designation, of course, further clinical trials will still be required because you'll still need to establish a risk-benefit ratio and still need to gather the entire clinical data. In the EU, we also can have the conditional marketing authorization approval. So in the US, it's usually called accelerated approval in the same way as it can be in the US, but in the EU, you can get conditional marketing authorization approval based on your phase 2 data and that less complete data. And again, this is mainly meant for medicines for unmet medical needs and based, of course, on shown favorable benefit-risk balance. That gives also developers early market access based on the incomplete data or phase 2 data. But as I said, it's important to complete clinical trials after conditional market authorization is obtained. In the EU, there was a pilot program on adaptive pathways. So that program has stopped to exist and has been dissolved between conditional marketing authorization and PRIME designations. But the intention of this program was to ensure the, I would say, interactive development and rolling review in the same way as Fast Track is in the US. And that basically gives quicker and I would say more dedicated and more to the point development, because the rolling review means that the agency reviews the data as soon as they become available. So that was mainly used during the COVID vaccines. That's why one of the reasons that the COVID vaccines were approved rather quickly is that the agencies were ready to review the data as soon as they became available. So that is basically a step-by-step approval based on the continuous evidence gathering, and that is that's not a shortcut, but it allows shorter approval because of designated time and of the agencies to review the data as soon as possible. And that means that the data collection is ongoing and also from real world evidence. There are also exceptional circumstances approvals. In the US, I think it's animal rules approval. So what does it mean? It's only applicable to very rare diseases and studies which can be unethical or impossible to basically to start and finish the full-blown, full-scale clinical trial. And that means that although full data cannot be obtained, the patient still cannot be limited. So this should not be in that situation that they don't have access to maybe the last treatment they can have, especially in case of ultra rare diseases. If that happens, if that approval is given, so it's approval. So it's not that I would say intention. So you'll receive approval for the drug, but then of course the agency will continue monitoring the efficacy and the safety of the drug and will ensure continuous monitoring. because although this option exists, there should be always a continuous monitoring. No, that's okay. We can move to the next slide. So if we talk about, I would say, rare diseases, ultra rare diseases, so orphan diseases, then it's very good to review and compare programs, for example, for orphan designation, so the ODD, and non-orphan drug. And what the SME status could mean in those situations. So all three programs are listed on this slide. And if you have orphan drug designation, or at least if your drug is developed for an orphan disease, that means that you could apply for orphan drug designation. Of course, you need to comply, first of all, with the criteria for orphan drug designations, which is the number of populations. There should be number of patients should be not more than one in 200,000 European citizens. And that means that if the criteria are met, or it's very financially impossible to develop the drug, so that should be another criteria of the orphan designation which is met. And that means that in that case, you would need to submit a briefing book and apply for orphan designation. And if you do that, if you apply for orphan designation, there is always a possibility to undergo a pre-submission meeting before the formal submission of the orphan designation application. So such pre-submission meetings are not mandatory, but they're highly recommended. And the reason why they're highly recommended is that the EMEA will assess your draft application and applicability of the application and allowability of application for the orphan drug designation. And the EMEA will look whether all orphan designation criteria are met. So in that way, after the such a pre-submission meeting, you'll get an outcome, whether there are any gaps or not. And if there are no gaps, you will be able to submit your final application, and basically the approval will only be a formal approval. And after the orphan designation has been granted, it's always recommended to undergo a scientific advice meeting, which is called the protocol assistance meeting in case of granted orphan designation. And that shows that, and that will show also the developers that the data gathering in orphan designation can be very challenging, but also can be very dedicated. And that's where EMEA can play a significant role in such advice meetings and protocol assistance meetings. And of course, after all, the clinical trial application will need to be conducted, and the data should be gathered. So if we talk about a normal drug, which is not for orphan disease, then you would undergo the same similar steps applying for scientific advice. Because remember, I said just before the start of the clinical trial, and especially pivotal clinical trial or first-in-human trial, it's advisable to undergo a scientific advice meeting. So for such a scientific advice meeting, you would still need to prepare a briefing book and submit it and get approval, or at least concurrence of the FDA with the strategy for clinical data gathering. And after that, the clinical trial application can be submitted and clinical trial can be executed. In total, the scientific advice meeting would take approximately 4 months. And it's very valuable to get that advice. Remember, I said that EMEA, unlike FDA, takes fees for scientific advice, and those fees can range from 50 to 100,000 euros. And it's a pretty significant figure for drug developers, especially if they are small companies. But if you look at the incentives FDA gives to developers of orphan drugs or drugs for orphan diseases, then you see here in the I think that it's a slightly orange color on the screen that the reduction of the fee for orphan drug designation, drugs granted with orphan drug designation, is 75%. So if you take a figure of 100,000 euro as the basis for the scientific advice, that means that 75,000 will be reduced. So that means that only 25 will remain and will need to be paid to the agency. But at the same time, if the company is also a small or medium enterprise and develops a drug for orphan disease, then the fee reduction will be 90%. So bring the fee down to 10,000 euros. And so I would say so the 90% if it's non-OTD, but if it's an orphan designation and it's a small company, then the fee will be reduced to 0. So companies which are SME qualified and develop a drug for orphan designation, they will get complete fee reduction of the scientific advice. So that's very interesting to know for companies, and especially the companies which fall in those small and medium enterprise classification. And the companies which are not located in the European Union, because these reductions and disincentives are applicable to European companies, but non-EU companies can benefit of those reductions when they work with consultancies which are accredited as SME and therefore have those benefits and can transfer the benefits they have in the EU to their overseas clients, which are small businesses as well. So like us, we have those benefits from the European Union. We are accredited as a small and medium enterprise, and therefore we can add our clients, overseas clients, to our license so that they can benefit from the same reductions we get from the European Union. So that means that there are different options available. And if you look at the process of getting those benefits, as I said, we will need to add companies to our license, and it will take some time. But it usually takes 2 months to add a small and medium enterprise to our license to be able to transfer our benefits. And that can be done in parallel with the pre-submission meeting, for example, for orphan drug designation. So that is normal practice to do that in parallel so that no time is lost. So if you look at the US, and there should be a pop-up coming for the US picture, then we see also that FDA provides similar benefits to the developers of orphan drugs, and the fee reductions, they are applicable on the first NDA, so basically waiver to PDUFA fee application, the first NDA, and it's about $3 million, and it's based on the data from 2022. So apologies for the third 2 and the year number, so it's not 20,000 but 2022. And the FDA provides also a tax credit on clinical testing expenses. And in case of USME benefits, FDA also provides, as I said, for the SME, the reduction on the first NDA or BLA. So there are similar benefits, but they are rather limited in the US in comparison to the European Union, because the benefits listed here on this slide are only applicable to scientific advice for the European Union. But the benefits for the SME companies, they exist across the entire development. And that means that the developers will be able to get significant reductions on the fee, for example, during the the inspections by the agencies and the different stages of development. So in conclusion, there are more fee reductions in Europe comparing to the US, although both agencies provide those I would say incentives to orphan drug developers and to companies as small and medium businesses. So I think I will transfer back to Paulina.
Thank you, Valentina. I'm going to speak a little bit more about the costs of clinical development, which takes a huge part of the total costs for development of the drugs. The budget of any clinical trial generally breaks down into two major components. The costs of CRO services, also known as professional service fees, and to what we call pass-through costs, or PTCs for short. PTCs are all of the expenses that are passed directly to the sponsor at actual cost. These typically include things like travel, logistics, and courier services, study supplies, payments to other vendors subcontracted by the CRO, and very importantly, investigator grants and fees paid to medical institutions for recruiting and treating patients. And I want to show you a few side notes as a little comparison between Europe and the US. So the professional service fees in Europe could be twice as lower as in the US. And the second note is referring to site and investigator grants, which could be 4 or 5 times less as in the US. The difference is quite striking, isn't it? There's often please back to the slide. There's often a misconception that the bulk of study budget goes directly to the CRO as a revenue. In reality, more than half of the total costs are PTCs, expenses that do not contribute to CRO profit at all. And based off our experience, we've ran over 400 clinical projects in the last 18 years. We've analyzed numerous budgets and found that on average, our service fees account for about 40% of the total study budget. And that's it on my end, and I'll pass it over to Philip.
Thank you, Paulina. So, with that initial oversight on the budget, I want to deep dive a bit on, let's say, the details of a clinical trial budget and give some highlights on how can you actually have a look, given the overall strategy and the development pathway that you intend to take when basically making decisions on clinical trials. So first off, I'll have a look essentially about on the study design, to look at first the indicational sample size and how it basically impacts the cost of a clinical trial, and the study duration and the study procedures. So starting with the indication and sample size, obviously one important aspect which Paulina mentioned is the investigator grant fee. And the investigator grant fee usually is paid by patient. So obviously, the more patients you have to include into a clinical trial, the more expensive it will get. So you see the little note with the European map, and as we have noted earlier, there's a difference between the cost of investigator grant fees and cost in general between Eastern European and Western European or Central European countries. So obviously, in that case, it's important to understand where, in terms of prevalence, in terms of cost, one can actually perform a clinical trial, whether that fits the strategy you have designed, and in the case of discussions with EMA, discussed with regulatory authorities, and how that fits with your cost, right? So that's one of the most important factors when planning the clinical trial in the very beginning, looking at your market opportunities, and therefore also defining what roughly 20-30% of the 48% of a clinical trial cost overall will be going to. The same thing applies for obviously study duration. The longer study, the higher the grant fees will be in the study procedures. The more you have, the more complex they become. Also, the higher the institutional investor grant fees will be. So that stresses the importance that the study design will basically have when you create your strategy and the impact that it will have on your budgets. If you look at the study organization, there's different aspects you have to consider. There's geography, so where do you actually perform the clinical trial in terms of the regulatory fees, but also in terms of the economic factors, as I've just mentioned, and as well in terms of the IMP import, right? So again, depending on the geography, there will be a significant impact in terms of pass-through cost with regards to the grant fees, but other geographic cost factors such as regulatory fees and the IMP import. In addition, there might be additional risks and critical processes that apply when you perform a clinical trial. And that feeds in again into the complexity of the clinical trial. And therefore, the per patient grant fees play an important role in essentially making sure that either you perform your clinical trial in a place where there's not many competing studies, and therefore you have a free way, basically because you're the only clinical trial addressing a certain indication or a certain medical need, or to make sure that you have the right impact and positive benefit if you go into a competing space, and therefore have to make sure that your clinical trial has the right funding to manage. And finally, the overall study timelines obviously are the most important aspect. So recruitment plays a role here. And again, the per patient grant fees and the patient number plays an important role, because the longer the recruitment as a main factor in the overall study timelines, the higher the cost. And that impacts not only your organization, not only professional service fees, that also impacts all vendor costs that will basically charge you monthly or over time. So it's the biggest driver and the biggest caution that you have to make. So therefore, also choice of location, choice of geography plays an important role. There's a difference if you amass these costs over time in the US compared when you amass this time in Eastern Europe. So what can Paleosis do for you to address all these challenges, and also to make sure that you make the right choices with the terms of geographic strategy, but also country selection and early strategic discussions. So starting early, as mentioned before, is very important. So we think that a collaboration with the authorities is very important. That can be done through working with StarUDA as an important strategic advisor in the very beginning or as early as possible, and as well as Paleos to engage in an integrative approach to basically improve your cost effectiveness by design. So you start in the very beginning thinking about your budget restrictions, about your overall financials, about the goals that you have, and how you can reach those goals by looking at different aspects from design to geography and to discuss those with the authorities. And that is best done by including available email programs from the initial planning phase. With regards to geography, it is important to understand the standard of care and the connected medical need in any country that you want to conduct a clinical trial. Therefore, make your geographic choices accordingly. That also impacts the general cost levels of these countries and the competing trials and programs. So the operational executions of these trials in the European Union will be heavily relying on those strategic choices, and it will have an impact on how well you will be able to execute a clinical trial as planned, and therefore on time and budget. So I'll hand over to Valentina for the next slide.
Yes, and from our side, what can we do for any client ex-Europe interested in coming to Europe for to get market authorization applications? What we can do is to help with the regulatory strategy first, because regulatory strategy is your key to get into the development and to get the right clinical execution and gathering of clinical data. In addition to that, of course, as I said, the contact with a regulatory agency is crucial during the entire development process, and we can ensure your smooth way to the EMEA, to contacting the agency and discussing different development topics and development questions. And that by applying our SME benefits will mean that the cost reductions will be applicable, and that means that there will be less financial burden on the organizations to undergo scientific consultation with the agency. And of course, for developers of drugs for orphan diseases, we can guide those companies through the entire orphan drug designation process and ensure the positive orphan drug designations, which will ensure the additional benefits during further development process. And of course, as I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, is that we can be your legal representative in the European Union, because in every region you would need to have your local representative in the same way as in the US. A local representative is needed for the submission to the FDA, because we can prepare a file, but we can submit, but we still need to have a local contact. The same happens also in the EU. We can be your European legal representative, and even for orphan drug designation, that can only be granted to European companies. So we could be that company which assists you to get the orphan designation application and then transfer that designation to you as the owner of the designation. As I mentioned in the beginning, the GMP is really crucial for developers of any drugs. And of course, GMP is applicable in the US and the EU, but still there could be differences in the understanding and differences in some guidances with respect to GMP compliance. We can guide you through that. We can ensure also that audit readiness and ensure audits and do the inspections and do the remediation activities if there are any gaps found. And of course, as mentioned, QP is needed for Europe. There should be European QP, although there is mutual recognition agreement between the regions, and but that means that the testing doesn't have to be repeated, but the qualified person should be appointed within Europe, in the same way as there should be European QPPV available for any companies undergoing marketing authorization application. And in the end, we can be your guide to every step you need to undergo in Europe, and we can be your reliable partner for your European entrance. Back over to you, Philip.
So thank you, Valentina. So to wrap it all up, we want to finish first with a couple of do's and don'ts to summarize from the clinical perspective and as well as a regulatory perspective what we think is important. So from a clinical perspective, as repeated again and again, do align early with regulatory and commercial strategy. Very important to have the right path and the right goal aligned. Do adjust your clinical strategy with regulators. Again, also very important, it's the biggest cost factor. Make sure that not only you think your clinical strategy is perfect, but also the regulators. So do configure your trial location with local experts. Very important with regards to the local regulatory standards, but also very important with regards to the standard of care that is taking place locally, which can differ in Europe. Also do ensure understanding clinical trial budget structure, as it will be the biggest part of your overall drug development budget. It is important to understand where what belongs, and therefore being able to understand and talk to your CRO partner about this budget. And I can only point to a webinar that we have done on that exact topic that you can find on our website. And finally, a last stone, do not chase financial milestones if not for survival. So very important, I think it matters to stick to your strategy and don't be diverted if not needed. Obviously, if you need to survive, you need to do what you need to do for survive, but that should be the main point to be made here. So I'll hand over to Valentina for the regulatory perspective.
Yeah, that's a good topic, like from what you know now from the, what is important from clinical perspective. And I like the last one, the don't, because that's a really crucial one. But I will start with do's. And I think it's important to emphasize that the TPP, target product profile, is one of the important starting points for your regulatory strategy. Because at the end, when you develop a drug, you need to make sure that, so what is the drug doing? Why do you develop the drug? And coming from the disease, what does drug do? And going into the entire quality and target product profile. And as I mentioned, and I've tried to emphasize during the entire presentation, is that the interaction with regulatory agency is really important. And you need to do that because the final agency approving the drug and given the green light for you to sell the drug is the agency you will be submitting to. So if it's EMEA, the European Medicines Agency, which is responsible for the entire Europe, so that means that you need to align with them, listen to them, take their worries, understand their top points, understand their advices, and take them on board. So that the agency doesn't hesitate in your clinical evidence data. As I said, of course, although the safety is very important, but at the end, efficacy is the biggest piece for the approval. Don't forget to apply European GXP rules. It means that GLP, GCP, GMP rules are applicable at different stages of development. This is a critical requirement and very important for approval. And of course, do gather data, clinical evidence in a representative population, because as also the FDA accepts foreign studies, European agency also accepts foreign studies, not in Europe, but that data should be in the European representative population, and that should be really considered very carefully. And don't forget to have the EU legal representative in place and the QP and QPPV at the market authorization stage. Back over to you, Philip.
So, key takeaways. What have we learned for today? First off, the EU market for drugs can be an attractive market for US companies, specifically because there is in both regions, if you will, Caucasian population and increasing FDA EMA alignment. So that means there are working groups and even better alignments being made between FDA and EMA. There are similar programs that you can build on. And so there's a certain share of preparation possible between both regions. And you can use at least a certain part of patients for both applications for marketing authorization. In terms of clinical costs, in Europe, 50% of the total development costs are clinical, and therefore it is obviously an interesting and a favorable market if you're looking into optimizing your clinical trial budget. Then the regulatory support programs mirror the FDA programs. We have shown that before, and you've seen the similarities and the advantages that both give. And so there's better and better alignment. Both agencies are working on how to align their programs, starting with ODD in different working groups, but also in others. So that gives you an opportunity to gather benefits from both kind of pathways that are offered and programs that are offered in the regions. Finally, how do we achieve cost efficiency? Using the right regulatory program, right? I think that's the most important point. Talk to the authorities, talk to the agencies to understand whether the plan that you made is also the plan that the agency agreed to. If that is not the case, you might have to go back to square one because something did not align with their perspective. Then conducting clinical trials in lower cost markets is obviously a strategy that also can work if you have clarity about the requirements for your program. Then in terms of taking the right study organization and the right study design steps, I dove into them a bit earlier. Both of them can have a major impact in terms of your cost and then also in terms of your success with regards to requirements that are set within the programs that the agency set and also set by the approval. And finally, early engagement with regulators is strongly advisable and key to the whole discussion of your drug development program. So to sum it up, the integrated cost-effective approach is basically a drug development journey approach. You start with the end in mind and then focus on working through the different steps from non-clinical or preclinical to clinical to commercialization and take on the different programs that are offered by the agencies to make sure that alignment is reached, that no detour is made that will be adding to your cost. And what we can help with here is, being your companion from start to finish, but also jumping in from any point on this development roadmap, right? It could be from first in human, it could be from phase 3, it could be from the very beginning. So context is key, and so therefore I hope you enjoyed our webinar and took away some key lessons that you can apply for yourself. Thank you for listening.